Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Really happy to be joined again by Seth Zeren. Seth and I, the last time we talked to each other, I think we talked for over an hour kind of complaining about architecture school and had a great conversation about it, and then realized we didn't record it and it really should have been a podcast. We'll have to come back and do that again, Seth, sometime. What do you think?
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. It was, well, I think we ended up just kind of ranting on for quite a while about architecture and design school. And I know you've got something new that you're working on. Maybe we can get to towards the end of the podcast on that. But I really wanted to bring Seth back on. Seth has a Substack called Build the Next Right Thing. He writes great material on there, like me and others who are very busy. He doesn't write frequently, but the posts are very long and thoughtful when he does post. And he published one not long ago called Two Great Tastes That Taste Great Together. And the subhead is What Strong Towns and Abundance Have to Teach Each Other. I found this post super interesting and very much important kind of in the moment of what we are talking about in the housing advocacy world in particular. And I wanted to have Seth on so we could kind of dig into this topic a little bit. And so Seth, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So always great to chat. Seth, if you don't know Seth, I've had him on in previous episodes. He's a man who wears many hats. He's not just a housing advocate. He's also a developer. He's a planner. And he's done many, many things and does many things on a regular basis. So I always find people like Seth very interesting because they aren't just talking about things, they're doing things. And it makes the analysis that Seth and others provide just much more interesting because it's not theoretical. So with that lead in, Seth, I wonder if you could talk about why did you want to write this particular piece?
Well, Kevin, that's a very kind introduction. I appreciate that a lot. I mostly feel like I'm flailing about.
we all do in our own way. So
right, that's middle age has come for me. But yeah, this piece has been a while in Genesis, right? And I think by way of sort of background, I have been part of the Strong Towns conversation for 12, 13 years. I'm a founding member, whatever that's worth. And I've also been involved in sort of the YIMBY movement as well for about as long. I was involved in a group in Cambridge, Massachusetts when I was living there called Better Cambridge, which has become Abundant Housing Massachusetts. And in Rhode Island, where I am now, in Providence, we've started our own statewide pro-housing organization called Neighbors Welcome Rhode Island. And that group would consider itself a YIMBY organization and broadly connected to the broader abundance movement or set of objectives, right? So I've been sort of in both worlds for a long time. I've written a lot for Strong Towns. I've been active in YIMBY organizing. And as you mentioned, by day, I'm a real estate developer. So that gives me a lot of ground truth in what I advocate for, because I put my own money, time, effort, hope into implementing stuff. And if it doesn't work, and then we pay the consequences. So we got skin in the game. So I wrote this piece because I've been noticing as the housing crisis, housing shortage, housing problem, predicament, whatever, has been growing and becoming bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger problem. And not just in the coastal areas where I'm from in the San Francisco Bay Area, but now not even just in regions, but like really across the whole country now. In many, many, many cities and many regions, housing prices have risen to a much higher ratio to incomes. And so this problem is becoming much, much bigger. And now everyone's trying to figure out what to do about it, right? And you're getting a lot of ideas from left, right, center, from libertarians, from conservatives. It's a very complicated and messy situation. And I didn't include this metaphor, but it's something I think a lot about, which is that there's an old proverb about the blind men who are tasked to just decide what an elephant is. And so one of them is touching the leg and says it's a tree, it's like a tree trunk. And another one grabs the trunk and they're like, oh, it's like a snake. Another one's holding the ear and they're like, well, it's like a big leaf. And another one's at the tail and it's like a brush, right? This problem is so big and has so many different facets and parts that it's very easy to focus on the ones that you are most aware of, most incensed by, that most directly affect you, or most directly affect the region or city that you work in. And so I feel like this whole conversation has this sort of like, we're all working on a similar thing, but we can't all sort of grasp it at the same time. And then what happens is that we get annoyed with other people when they don't agree with our priority, right? I think that finance is the biggest problem. No, I think land use is the biggest problem. No, I think building code is the biggest problem, and so forth. And then that interpersonal tension begins to create like a barrier to communication and understanding, right? So my goal in writing this piece was to try to explain strong towns to sort of YIMBY abundance people in a way that strong towns would recognize, right? Not a caricature, like a real, honest, heartfelt insider view, but in a way that I think abundance can understand it. And conversely, I want to explain strong abundance to strong towns folks in a way that strong towns can understand it, and that is true to abundance. Because what I often see when I read different takes, pro and against, I don't recognize myself or the world that I see in these takes. They're flattened in one way or another, and I've been around them long enough. Maybe I have a little extra context, so hopefully that's a service I'm trying to provide here. And that's where I came to the metaphor of like the two great tastes that taste great together, which is a very old like Reese's peanut butter cup ad, right? Yeah. It's peanut butter and chocolate. You never think about it. We just stick them together. You're gonna love it. Yeah. And that's sort of my view is that like strong towns is a different flavor than abundance. It's true. They have different cultural origins. They have different practices, different core memberships. They respond, I think, to subtly different, though related moral crises that really animate them. But I actually think that each has a lot to teach the other one, and both would be stronger if they could learn from each other. And I don't want them to sort of balkanize into different camps that like are sniping at each other and not learning from each other. That would be bad, in my view.
So I think the people who listen to my podcast probably are more familiar with the strong towns conversation and mindset. I've had Chuck on. I've had him on a couple of times. And I think there's just general a little more familiarity. So why don't you take a minute and characterize the abundance conversation and what you see as the key points of that? Obviously there was a big book that came out earlier this year that Ezra Klein and I think Derek Thompson wrote. And that's what has really kicked off a lot of this conversation, but you tie it back to the YIMBY movement. And so why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a fair point. I'll just say, as by way of introducing and contrasting the two movements, when I mentioned sort of moral crises, and I think both movements are animated by a strong sense of moral outrage and moral optimism. Strong towns, I feel like, at one point, I think they've updated it, but the website used to say a broken development pattern is bankrupting your city and endangering your neighborhood. A member-powered movement is fighting back. Like that's a call to sort of moral action, right? There isn't a similar thing I could say for abundance, but what I wrote in my piece was that there's sort of something like a morass of regulations, industry capture, and incumbent interests is clogging up our economy, leading to shortages of essential needs like housing, energy, education, medicine, while taking away the energy of voters and public officials to change course, right? We feel trapped. We can't change course. And I would contrast that. I feel like the abundance movement is more of an elite movement. I mean, not in a pejorative sense. There's a lot of academics, there's a lot of professionals, journalists who are core people in the movement, but we're really focused on policy reform and electoral strategies, right? So there's a subtle set of distinctions. I would say Strong Towns is particularly focused on culture change and is particularly worried about the moral problem of fiscal insolvency, right? If you don't have any money, you can't take care of people. And that's true. And I think abundance is saying, we have a lot of homeless people, or for instance, or we need a lot of clean energy, and we just can't build the stuff. And that's a moral crisis. We have these big problems, homelessness and climate change. We just can't actually get out of our own way. That's a moral crisis. It needs a response. So I would contrast those two stories. So I think in terms of the lineage of abundance, where does this abundance conversation come from? I do think you have to go back, 15 years at least into the early days of the YIMBY movement, right? The Yes in My Back movement, which is also only about that old. It's about as old as Strong Towns, plus or minus. And a lot of it was, a very, concentrated in cities like San Francisco, Boston, New York, DC, where housing demand was really high, housing prices were really high, and people were going to planning meetings, and someone would propose a big apartment building or whatever, and 100 people would show up in opposition. And the young activists at the time, many of them were renters, were like, well, this is not okay. I would like either myself or other people to go rent in this building, but incumbent homeowners are blocking it, right? And so the focus was very much on fighting NIMBYs and then zoning change and land use reform to allow people to build again in their cities, right? And I was one of those people who was priced out of Cambridge, right? Because we didn't build enough. And I lost a lot of friends also left Cambridge. So to us who were there at that point, it is a very intense, challenge. It's a moral crisis. It's something you feel like you really have to address. If you want to have a stable society where you have, you can live in a place and have friends and start a family, this is really foundational stuff.
Yeah.
So you come from sort of that foundational story, and I think other pieces start to get added to it, right? Which is becoming this sort of larger abundance tent, right? And a big piece of that has been really, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how political we want to get here, but obviously national politics has changed a lot in the last 12 years.
Yeah.
And 10 years. And part of that is, I'd say that there's a bunch of sort of libertarians who would have maybe traditionally been on the right, but feel a little homeless right now, who are really interested in deregulation, really care about economic efficiency. And, some important folks in that, including Tyler Cowen, who writes at March for Revolution. And there's a think tank called the Niskanen Center, which was actually founded as a libertarian policy shop that has sort of transformed itself into maybe one of the main centers of the abundance movement over time. But there is a real strand that comes out of a sort of a free market libertarian, let's let people build stuff on land, right? Let's let, market can solve many of these problems if we get out of people's way. And so as that strand comes, it's not just about land use. It's also about, pharmaceutical research, right? It takes so much money and so long to research drugs. It's about occupational licensure. Why does it take, a 60-hour, credit course to become a hairdresser? And you can't even transfer it across state lines, that kind of stuff. They see it as stuff gumming up the economy. And then you add to that sort of the climate change piece, right? Is people want to build clean energy, and there's a big realization we're going to need long distance transmission lines. And there's a realization that we just aren't able to build those in any reasonable way today in the United States because of the permitting rules. And often it's environmental permitting rules that are preventing you from building clean energy power lines. And so those are some of the threads that are kind of coming together. And then in 2019, there's a really important article that was published in the Michigan Law Review, I think it was, called The Procedure Fetish. And this was by a guy named Nicholas Bagley, who's a law professor at the time. I think he's now working at Niskanen. And the procedure fetish is this idea that on the left, people want government to work, and they usually blame the right for messing it up. Right? They don't want to have taxes. They don't want to do we can't have nice things because the Republicans or the conservatives aren't letting government function. And the procedure fetish piece is really written tracing a lineage, I'd say going back to the 60s. And actually, Mark Dunkelman's book, Why Nothing Works, also traces some of this lineage. Another sort of abundance book coming out around the same time as Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein's Abundance. The procedure fetish is this idea that like government also has to be restrained, right? Government does bad stuff. Urban rule was bad. There's a lot of things that shouldn't have happened that were bad, and we should make sure government doesn't do bad things.
Right.
And the way we're going to do that is we're going to put a bunch of rules and procedures around government action. And that has continued to build up since the 1960s to the point where I think his observation was you would see people who want to make change happen, but they also, their only solution to a problem is to like add more rules. So we need to build more power lines. Okay, let's write another rule about it. We need to go through more meetings, more process, and it takes longer and longer and longer. And so procedure fetish is basically one of these arguments that says actually a good bit of this problem lies on the left, that we have been so concerned about government overreach that we've made so that government can't actually do anything. And so that piece, I remember when Ezra Klein, interviewed Nicholas Bagley right after that came out, and was like, clearly that was a signal moment for a lot of folks in the growing abundance movement, was to realize the problem is not them. The problem is also us. Like, we need to reform some stuff about how we approach government. Why are blue states the ones with the worst housing crises and all these other related problems, right? If we can't govern ourselves, like, why should anyone else trust us to govern other things? So there's a whole bunch of these threads that are kind of coming together, and there's probably more of them I could get to, but this sort of bundle of things has come together, and now Abundance has had, I think they had their second annual conference in September of this year. So they have a national conference too. And there's definitely a lot of interest in this abundance framework. The idea, and I'd say that to paraphrase Ezra Klein's writing on this in the past, he says like a liberalism that builds, right? A liberalism that's not just telling other people what to do. It's not just setting up a bunch of rules. It's actually going to go build stuff that people need, whether it's power plants or houses or trains. Like, we're going to go get stuff built. And a real callback to like the FDR period, right? We're all sort of like, how did they get so much done in the 1930s? So that I think is a lot of does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Kevin, in terms of like the evolution of this?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great background. Is there a way to give like a 3 or 4 bullet point summary of what you think like the abundance goals are in very simplistic terms? Like, what exactly, if the conference that gets together could achieve their top 3 or 4 like outcomes, what would those actually be?
I don't know that I can. I don't think, and this is part of my observation or my frustration. Sometimes people characterize abundance as like there's someone in charge.
Yeah.
Or that because Klein and Thompson wrote a book named Abundance, that somehow they're the standard bearers. But like, lots of people disagree with them about stuff. They're not setting the agenda. And I would say that I think their book is a little bit different than the overall package, because I think their book is still trying to sell the idea that we could change course towards the left. And it's generated a lot of fighting on the left.
Yeah.
Around that. But they're saying like, actually, like, sometimes fewer regulations will be beneficial, is like actually fighting words in a lot of parts of the country.
For
right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And, but that's part of the case we're making, right?
Yeah.
They're making is that's important. So there's no one in charge. Like there's a conference. I did not go to it. I don't really know what happened there. I read a little bit of reporting about it. I would say that the big topics are housing, clean energy, are the two probably the biggest ones. But also, state capacity, the idea of like the government should be able to do stuff. Jen Palka is an author who wrote a book called Recoding America, which was about why the government is terrible at IT
Hmm.
and can't run a website. And she has a lot of ideas on how you can fix it. But a lot of it just comes back to contracting rules from the 1960s. The way the government buys stuff is just not like any other business would buy stuff.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. So you got to change the rules, right? Now, some people will say, well, that's deregulation because you're changing the rules. You're making it easier to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah, maybe. I think there's a strong orientation towards that material results matter. If you don't build the housing, it didn't work,
Yeah.
kind of thing. You don't get to follow the rules and get an attaboy just because you followed the rules and nothing happened.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, there's no question. If you were to just do a short history of thinking about like planning and development issues that we all could talk about, like coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, the federal government had a lot of capacity. It had a lot of really smart people working in it, and it established some programs that did really big things, even in the post-war era. So, we built the interstate system, and then we undertook the urban renewal program. And then, really, what happened is, uh, a decade or so into the urban renewal program, a lot of people were horrified by what we were doing, which gave birth to Jane Jacobs and people who were just like, this shit needs to stop because we're destroying our
Yeah.
cities. Um, and and so then that began the process of sort of the public participatory process, which really was not what Jane Jacobs was saying. A lot of what she was saying, I think, was misinterpreted by like the planning profession and others. But it really gave rise to that whole notion, like you talked about, that we need to slow government down because uh, the expert class that was running our agencies was actually doing really bad things, and we need to pause and actually talk to people and make sure that we want government to do these things. And that all, again, that which also sounds very reasonable. Um, but then what happens, like everything, it metastasizes to the point where now it's just incredibly hard to do just about anything. Like virtually every development project in every city of size is discretionary, and which would have been unheard of in a previous era. So it seems to me like a lot of that, a lot of what we're seeing is sort of like the pendulum swinging back again to say we had a good idea at the time, and here's where it took us, and now we need to course correct.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what we're sort of wrestling with. And the debate has become sort of summarized as top down versus bottom up,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Strong towns is sort of team bottom up, right? They want to see change coming from the bottom up. They want cities and towns to lead and be the I don't know the highest level of local coordination, right? Not the lowest level of a ladder of government. And might characterize abundance as being a more of a top down kind of movement. And I think that's not entirely fair. Like most of the YIMBY folks that I have met started out at the city level and worked really hard at the city level and eventually realized it was going to be more effective to work at the state house level. And they didn't stop working at the city level. They're doing both. But you got to sometimes work on problems at different levels
Yeah,
because that's the appropriate scale to address the problem. And, so, but, the state preemption idea, right, that states might tell municipalities what has to be in their zoning ordinance is, you know, like you said, we've had 2 or 3 generations now, 4 generations, where municipalities have had a pretty free hand in land use regulation. And they've used that pretty free hand to clamp down more and more and more on what's possible by right, what's possible at all, and to add more and more layers of requirements and stuff. So it's very hard to build anything. It's not all of the story, but it's a big part of the story.
yeah. Let me frame like the best and maybe the best case and maybe not the worst case, but a more cautionary tale for each of these, and have you react to it. So like uh, the bottom up ideal espoused by strong towns truly is something that empowers all sorts of people to take control of their own lives and their communities and do good in ways that are frankly hard to measure, but really can make a community work. and improve a place in ways that a lot of other programs cannot, or government programs cannot. And then on the top down side, I mean, I think you can absolutely make the case that the states are the ones that are enabled to tell communities what they can and cannot do in most of the country. Not everywhere, where there are some different setups, home rule versus Dillon's rule, et cetera, et cetera. But by and large, um, local governments have boundaries on what they're allowed to do as determined by the state government. And states are fully within their rights to tell local governments, like they can't restrict certain people's basic rights, or even civil rights. And so you might argue that property development is a basic civil right. So I think that's kind of a best case. Now the cautionary tale might be, on the bottom up side, there are just certain things that you just cannot accomplish bottom up. I mean, they take a collective effort of some kind to actually get done, and the wrong framework that you're within could make bottom up almost impossible.
Well, just as an example, only the current citizens of a town get to vote.
Right, right, exactly.
So the new building gets no votes,
Yeah,
right? And so,
yeah. We used to say in New British charrettes, somebody has to represent in the room the future residents of the place, because they get a voice too. And then the cautionary tale, obviously, on the top down, is that you can absolutely create echo chambers when in the expert class who do really, really bad things and cause tremendous damage, but think that they're doing good things. And,
yeah.
and so there is kind of I can see like an argument pro and con uh, on either one of these.
Yeah, no, I had a line in my piece paraphrasing someone else's article, and it was like to answering the question of top down or bottom up. My answer is it depends on the
Yeah,
circumstances, right? And it's not because I'm a squish who can't pick a side. It's because that's the right answer.
yeah,
Like sometimes, so I think it's about being comfortable with non-dogmatic answers to these questions and being humble and curious are incredibly important values. I mean, at the Strong Towns National Gathering, Chuck, at the big keynote was making the point that, the virtues of Strong Towns that we need to embody are humility, curiosity, and stewardship. And I think that's exactly right. And stewardship, humility, and curiosity mean that sometimes you have to figure out the right scale is to make the change. So you talked about some examples. Well, I think most folks in Strong Towns world would recognize the State Department of Transportation is often a problem
mm-hmm.
when it comes to neighborhood revitalization, right? If they own your main street, they're not going to be very easy to work with on street parking and better crosswalks. Well, guess what? If you want to reform the DOT and the MPO, you got to go to the State House. That's just how it works. Your town on its own is never going to have enough horsepower to really push the DOT around. The capital cities of these states don't have enough horsepower on their own to push DOT around. If you want to reform the building code to make it easier to build small multifamily dwellings, you got to go to the State House because that's a state law, right? There's a bunch of stuff that is at the state level, and we should not kid ourselves that we can only just work bottom up. Now, it's also true. I think Chuck makes a really interesting point, which is that if your story is only that, vote for our candidate to go up to the State House and work for you, that is also a bad story, right? The story where we encourage people to become dependents upon a political party or someone else, a faction that's going to take care of you, is also not good. Like, I do really believe in the concept of the strong citizen, where we want to encourage and empower people to be effective in their communities. That's why you should become a developer. That's my pitch, right? I'm a real estate developer by day and an advocate. And, I've got skin in the game. We're trying to build stuff. We're trying to get things done. And it's important to work on the rules. So you got to play the game and also change the game as you go. But having people empowered to understand their place and be effective in whatever capacity and ability that they are is really, really important. And I don't want to encourage some sort of dependence upon just vote for our candidate and send us a check and everything will be fine, because that's a bad idea.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't want
So,
to. Go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I don't want to be like too kumbaya about this, because there are difference is worth discussing, and there are a lot of nuances here. But there's uh, if you don't have the right state framework in place, it's going to be really hard to solve any of these problems. There's sort of a chicken and the egg thing here. On the other hand, if you don't have a cadre of local people in your community who are like empowered and ready to go and do things, you're also not going to have success.
Yeah,
Uh,
it takes both. That's why it's two great tastes that taste great together. That's the whole pitch. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we find this all the time. You can pass great state legislation, and then the municipalities poison pill it and drag their feet.
right.
So you need people at the ground level, and often people at the ground level will benefit from the state, putting a finger on the scale to help them, right? So that it goes both ways, and it's really important to collaborate across different scales. I want to, in terms of disagreements, I think there's a lot of opportunity for disagreement. And I think by putting these movements up next to each other and not shutting out the other movement, but honestly and forthrightly discussing our differences of opinion, in terms of organizing strategy and mechanics. So organizing strategy and lobbying and bill writing, that's important. But one of the things that I have a spicy take. You want my spicy take,
Oh,
Kevin?
I love a spicy take. Bring it on.
So I think in Strongtown's world, we talk about the idea that the local government should be this sort of highest level of collaboration for people. And I agree with that. But it does beg the question, are all towns legitimate in that way? Are all towns? So if I and my neighbors get together and say, well, we want to collaborate on our 6 square blocks and we want to make our own town, is that because I don't want to pay the property tax increase and whatever, we'll go do our own thing, right? So because often the tension will appear, like you'll see, and frankly, Twitter does not bring out the best in people, or Blue Sky or whatever, right? So you've seen YIMBYs on Twitter, and there's a few particularly loud ones who will be like, I'm going to drink NIMBY tears. I'm going to slam this condo building into their neighborhood, and they're going to take it.
Yeah.
And like, I get that as venting. We're all frustrated sometimes, but it's not very effective politics, I don't think. But I also get where it's coming from, right? Because I, too, grew up in a place that has raised a lot of children and has built no new homes. And so, spoilers, all the kids move away, and then the parents are old in their houses, and there's fewer people to take care of them, and it's like not a great situation. When municipalities are founded on the idea of exclusion, right, of fragmenting a metropolitan area so that they can kind of get their own little slice of it and not have to deal with the other parts of it, at what point, is that not a sort of natural municipality that should have its sort of natural rights as a municipality? And at what point is that sort of this exclusionary thing that maybe doesn't? So like there's examples in California all the time where like wealthy neighborhoods will be like, we're going to have a 50% inclusionary requirement on any building over 2 units. And that's not because they want affordable housing. It's because they want no new development.
Right.
It's a proxy, right? So all this bad behavior. And so there's a real sense of like these towns with $4 million homes are behaving badly, like, tough nuts. You got to go do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's my spicy idea. Are all towns legitimate?
Well, it's interesting because, one of the things that makes me think about is like, again, people in democracies, people tend to get what they deserve. And there's two things. Like one is humans don't really like really rapid change. We have an allergy to, I think we like change a little bit, but we really don't like rapid change. And so I have a lot of concern about, even though I would probably broadly call myself a YIMBY, I think people should be allowed to build things, and generally speaking, people should be allowed to build whatever they want to build. But there is an element of really massive, quick change in a place produces backlash because people don't like it.
Does.
And
and I would say it's worse than that too, which is that part of the reason why we don't like it is because for most people in the United States, they haven't seen a lot of neighborhood change in their neighborhood in 3 generations.
Yeah.
Right. Even if you live in a new neighborhood, it was built on a cow field, right? And no one else was like living there while it was happening.
Right.
So our grandparents, our great grandparents might remember when your city was actually growing, like in building lots of buildings. And now you see one tower crane in the sky. And you're like, oh my God, the growth. And what we forget is that our cities, quintupled in population in like 25 years between 1880 and 1905 or
Right.
whatever, right?
Right.
So that was rapid growth, and we
Right.
survived it. And
Yep.
most of our best architecture is also from that time.
Exactly.
Most of our best urbanism is from that time.
And it was generally
Um,
built by sort of an army of really small builders at the local level. And
Yep. And with no building code and no zoning code,
yeah,
but a good building culture. And that's like the best regulations can't make up for a bad building culture. And a good building culture doesn't need regulations,
right.
right? That's the crux of the problem. So
Yeah,
rebuilding our building
absolutely
culture
right.
is essential.
Yeah, and I think if you
So,
if you steel man like the NIMBY position, we had 2 or 3 decades of really obnoxious change in cities with urban renewal, with a lot of tear downs, a lot of modern architecture that frankly people just generally don't like,
don't like,
not very popular. And so people used what tools they had available to them to stop it,
yep.
which were really, really blunt instruments to say, nope, we're going to downzone, we're going to stop this, and we're going to try to freeze things in amber because we don't like this massive change that we're seeing.
Yeah. And I find myself sympathetic to that perspective, honestly. Like, it was really bad. It was a lot of bad stuff got done, and there was legitimate desire to shut it down.
For
I
sure.
get that. I'm
Yep.
in agreement. I think it's a dead end, right? You can't just sort of stand and stop change forever
Right.
and expect your community to actually prosper long term. And that's, I think, part of the dynamic that Strong Towns gets to is like the desire to make sure that these communities are dynamic and can
Right.
change and it can adapt. And, one of the stories I like to point out is that, at least in Rhode Island and a lot of parts of the country where there's not a lot of growth, if you took a neighborhood of 100 homes and every year one of those lots built an ADU or a side yard cottage or a duplex or whatever, that's one home per year on one lot. It's not a lot of change, but it's 1% housing growth, which is phenomenal for most parts of this country. And if you could multiply that across the metro area, it would be a tremendous change in our ability to grow. That's that sort of next increment of development, which I believe in. I think sometimes we're a little unrigorous in specifying exactly how it's going to work. With my developer hat on, like I need these projects to actually be financially viable, either for the homeowner or for a small builder.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're not going to happen. It's like a nice thought exercise. But the rate of change is real. So when I contemplate like how things could go wrong, because you had this sort of like, well, how could it go wrong? I think the YIMBY's great, or the abundance is great problem, or great, like, what would it look like if it went wrong in 25 years, 30 years, right? It takes a generation for us to realize the errors. I think two things. One, the fiscal impact piece that Strong Towns brings is a real problem. I don't see a lot of, there are a lot of crossovers, I should say. Like I was at YIMBY Town, a lot of people. There are Strong Town meetups, there's Strong Town groups from all over the place. There's a tremendous amount of crossover at the grass top level. But the place that abundance and YIMBY could go wrong is one, that we could build all these financially insolvent cities, and that would be a real problem going forward. That's definitely a real problem. And then I think also just that we might build a lot of ugly stuff,
Yeah.
and people aren't going to like that.
Yeah.
The urbanism might be really bad, and I think there's a sense that, well, we can't worry about that too much because people have been using beauty as a proxy to fight the project, and it's true, they have been. And it doesn't mean that like building good projects is not a good idea. Right? The urbanism matters if you want it to be sustainable as a cultural artifact, as a popular thing. I think the place where Strong Towns is at risk is that we may have a lot of like cool grassroots energy, but it doesn't really reach scale. I mean, that's the risk I see, is that it doesn't actually translate to enough change at an institutional level in in terms of actual construction. I mean, that's a potential fail state that I can imagine. But I wanted to talk about like, well, how might you navigate these dimensions, right? How do you navigate the choice between top down, bottom up? What's the right level of scale? And I look at it as sort of, there's like three layers as to whether this decision is going to work out or not. And one of which is definitely scale, right? It's like scale matters for a few things, right? One is the availability of information, right? So if you're working at a central office somewhere and you never even go to the project site, you lack a lot of information. So that might more likely make you to make bad decisions because you don't have context, you don't have detailed knowledge of what's going on. It also, you could have towns with too little power, right? So telling a town with one town planner that they should adopt a form-based code and they have no budget, it's not going to happen. That's not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
They would be really helped if the state provided some framework for them to use because they just don't have the internal capacity and expertise at that local level to do it. So scale really matters. And then also like sort of networks. So like transportation networks are going to be planned at a super municipal level because that's how it makes sense. And I think the realization we're realizing is that housing markets are bigger than one town. And therefore, we have to do some regional and statewide coordination where they just don't work. But scale isn't the only answer. Like, I think generally we understand the Tennessee Valley authorities who have been successful, right, all these years later.
Mm-hmm.
And that was no process. We're just going to go build a bunch of dams
Right.
and run a bunch of power lines and just, we'd like, you know, and then we, at the same time, we look at like the Cross Bronx Expressway and Robert Moses as being, you know, substantially a failure. Urban renewal, Kansas City especially, really terrible urban
We know
renewal.
it
I mean,
well. Yeah.
you can't imagine the billions of dollars of real estate you've just destroyed
I know.
today. So scale in of itself doesn't I don't think solves it. You know, I also look at Paris. You know, that was a massive top-down effort to transform Paris's boulevards out of a medieval framework, and it worked. Like, I think that's like the biggest case study that I think the sort of bottom-up folks have to engage with. Like, how did that work when so many other top-down efforts failed? I think is a really important question that I don't have a clear answer for. But I have two sort of sets of ideas. One is the next idea after scale is, well, what's the business model? What's the business model of the person or entity making this decision? Which is another way of saying, do they have skin in the game? So part of the problem for the DOT, for instance, in deciding whether to put a stroad through your town, through downtown Main Street, is who are they responsive to? Like, who do they listen to? Where do they get their money from? Who's on their board? Like, who are their friends? Who do they hang out with? Right? And that whole set of stuff, I think of sort of as the business model. So if they're more responsive to a board of business executives and state legislators, it's going to get a very different reaction than if they are responsible to the actual like abutters, the property owners and businesses that abut their road. But DOT doesn't actually get more or less money based on how your dog wash business did that year. It is irrelevant to DOT's operating budget. But the guy who runs the asphalt company is not irrelevant because he plays golf with the state senator, right? And so the business model of the entity that's making the decisions, that's why we talk a lot about the importance of neighborhood scale, small scale developers, because our business model is built in the communities and neighborhoods in which we work. And those places have to succeed for us to succeed. Like, we're farmers, we are embedded in this place. We cannot just bail when it gets hard. And so getting the incentives and the business model right for the decision maker is super important, super important. But then I think there's also just the ideas, right? If Robert Moses had different ideas, he would have done different stuff, right? And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of ideology and belief of what the right thing is to build. What's the good life? What's normal? What's evil? Those kinds of thoughts, biases, ideas that people have in them, and particularly when you centralize power in a small number of decision makers with a lot of authority, not a lot of accountability, what they believe matters a ton, right? Haussmann in Paris was doing something very different than Robert Moses was doing. And part of it was cars, but it wasn't just cars. Like, they had different ideas about what buildings should look like, how people should interact with the city. Those ideas are just different. And the same thing we can see in a lot of countries where they have actually repedestrianized areas. They're still doing it top down. Their business model is a national DOT, but they're pedestrianizing parking lots, and turning them into public squares again. You can do that. But it sort of says your ideas are really important. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about the importance of education. This is where I had a piece about the importance of new models of education for city builders, which was a little bit rejected by on a Strong Towns podcast. And I wrote about it, but I think this is really striking at this ideology piece. Like, the people who run your DOT need different ideas. That's it. I mean, the business model should change too, but the people who run it actually have to want to do different stuff, have to believe that different things would be better. Mm-hmm. So, those three levels. So sort of what's the scale? What's the appropriate scale? What's the business model? And then what's sort of the ideas or the ideology or the goals? that people have when they come to the project.
Well, let's
All three matter.
yeah, and let's talk about the political side of it too, because I mean, you can't remove the political side of this conversation from your desire to actually get something done. And we have a very polarized national politics, but there is a lot of this that sort of, abundance tends to align basically with cities and states run by Democrats. Strong Towns is a little much more nonpartisan. And then there are certainly think tanks that are much more Republican. And
Mhm.
um, we all, depending on where you live, you have to understand how to move the needle, depending on who's governing and what they're
Yeah.
going to listen to or not listen to, who they're going to listen to or not listen to. Like for
Yep.
example, I'm a live in a blue city in a red state, and both of those have though our city jurisdiction has very very different ideas about how things should be run than our state government does. But my attitude and talking to people all the time, which frustrates people, is it is what it is. Like, uh, you have to work within that context. If you want to make your cities better, you've got to understand the things that are going to appeal to both sides of the aisle. And so I think there's probably a lot from the abundance language that appeals to people who live in jurisdictions run by Democrats. And that's worth leaning into if you want to make change in that place. And by the same
Yeah.
token, you've got to figure out what you can do, what you would like to do in jurisdictions or states run largely by Republicans if you want to make change there too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think part of what is challenging here is right that the individual people involved, right? So just to take Ezra Klein, who I sort of know the best of a lot of these writers, right, is a pretty left wing guy in a
Hmm.
lot of ways, although there's plenty of people on the left who have disowned him as a
Hmm.
MAGA or whatever, based on this book. Um, who lives in San Francisco? He's lived in San Francisco and New York mostly,
Hmm.
in DC. So it's that's. I think he's writing. When I read the book, it's like he's clearly writing it to have this left debate, the sort of blue side Democratic Party debate between the sort of people who want to add more rules to solve problems and the people who are saying basically that didn't work. We need to actually build stuff. And that's a real tension, right? The people who want to focus on breaking up big companies versus the people who want to build trains is it's like results versus procedures, that core tension. Um, and that's a real tension.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's not a case you're going to make in another state. But I would say that the YIMBY movement has had a lot of successes in red states. I would say that
Absolutely.
actually
Yeah.
red states have been easier to win in because it's easier to make a property rights and a libertarian economic efficiency and economic growth case in a lot of red states than it is in a lot of blue states,
Yeah.
where there's a lot of other factions that also want a piece of that pie, whether it's labor or environmental groups,
Right.
social justice groups. It's a much more complicated terrain to work on.
Yeah.
So at YIMBY Town, they had, we had a land acknowledgement. We also had the Republican governor of North Dakota, I think, came and give a really great speech on all of their statewide housing reform. So that is, I would say that one of the strengths of abundance is that a really big tent, right? And I said no one's in charge. I mean, in some ways that's a good thing, right? You've
Yeah.
got multiple think tanks with good cadres of researchers all working on it, sometimes from slightly different perspectives. You've got multiple top tier journalists writing about it regularly. You've got dozens or hundreds of state and local level advocacy organizations that are very loosely affiliated mostly, but who share information and ideas. You've got funders providing funding support for a lot of those organizations too now, so they're beginning to staff. So there's a wide spread of authority and ideas, and there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of debate within the abundance and within the YIMBY movement, which I know better. Um, and I think, one of the lessons for Strong Towns, I think, is that Strong Towns is still sort of like one organization. It has individual chapters, and they're sort of independent. They're sort of doing their own things, but they don't have academic allies. They don't have think tank allies. They don't really have journalist allies. So, and I don't know. That's not something that's been tried to cultivate, but it means I think that it changes the ability to spread the message on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm sometimes I'm a big fan of Strong Towns. I've written a lot for them, but sometimes the ideas are not fully thought through. or they're thought through, but they've been challenged by people who disagree as much,
Mm,
right? And so the classic case I like to use is sort of the next increment of development.
right.
Yeah, it would be nice to think that I could just take a single family and add a floor to it and build it, make it a 2-family, or make an in-law suite. Those make a lot of sense colloquially, but don't make very much sense as an actual business model, because if you've done that, you would understand, right? So if you're not a practitioner, you don't understand. Making a separate dwelling unit means they're going to ask for a 1 or possibly 2 hour continuous fire separation between the two units and probably separate utilities, which is a deal breaker.
Yeah.
And there isn't a legal path to achieving that unit other than following the building code, guys.
Yeah.
So I think these are really good ideas, but they need careful testing and exploration, more than an advocacy group can do on its own. I think it would be really beneficial to have academics who are carefully engaging with the ideas. I think that the Ponzi scheme, where is the public economist or the public administration professor who's researching this and writing the academic reports that are going to back this up, so that it's not just coming from one organization, but there are lots of voices who are pointing out the municipalities are insolvent. You'd be much easier to make that case if it wasn't all you, but you had papers from other places who were saying, look, these towns, the budgets don't make sense. Like, the work that Strong Towns is doing is excellent and it's really important. And you need more friends, you need more allies, and you need, to expand it, to enhance it, to do more, to harden it up.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually a great teaser. I'm going to have Andrew Burleson on soon to talk about his adaptive zoning idea, because it cuts right to that core of what you're talking about, the notion of how do you actually achieve incremental change, sort of to the next level automatically. He wrote a really fascinating piece on it, and I want to dive into it more, because I think, like
Yeah,
you
that'd be great.
suggest, I have always struggled with, like, I love that idea in theory, but I struggle with how it works out in practice. Not just how you
Well,
regulate it, but how you make it financially feasible.
and my personal dream would be to have some sort of historians or economic historians who could do research for me.
Mhm.
If I had a little stable of historians, if I were a patron, because what I want to do is I want to dig into the history of how we actually built the parts of America we like the
Mhm.
brass tacks. I
Agreed.
want to go
Yeah.
into some construction firm's basement
Yeah.
and pull the old job files
Yep.
and understand what did they spend. What did labor cost? How did that project go? How did they finish that 4-story mercantile building in a year instead of 3 years? How did it work? What was the business model? What
Mhm.
was the insurance? What was the financing? Because I feel like we tell ourselves a lot of these sort of generic stories, and those are helpful. They point in the right direction. But I really want to know, literally, how did you do this? If we're going to replicate some of these buildings, we have to figure out how the business model worked and how all those other pieces worked. And I think you see this with I think you've talked to who's the Mason guy, Austin Tennell,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
We're realizing we've actually forgotten a bunch of how masonry was built, and
Yeah.
we're rediscovering or learning it from other countries, how to build with brick again, which sounds crazy because you're like, well, we never forget to build with brick, right? It's just brick and it's been around forever. But if you stop using the knowledge, you lose it.
Yeah.
And I feel like there is a tremendous exercise in excavating. And I think the CNU used to do this with a lot of their, they would go out and they just literally measure streets.
Absolutely.
This is a nice street. How wide is it? We don't know. No one's bothered to do this
That
yet. It's the same exercise.
that's
It's
how we all learned, So
go back and figure out, you say you like this main street. Can someone do the detailed economic and social, I don't know, history of that street and how it worked? Because I think we would learn a ton about how to run good main streets or good neighborhoods by excavating that history that got blown up when we just said everyone's going to go out to the strip mall and the subdivision, and we're going to lose it. We just those firms and those organizations all just closed up shop, and we don't know how that worked anymore. So that's sort of my dream. I would like to there's the story of Brainerd and its evolution, and that's a great story, but I want to see literally how did it work,
yeah.
what was driving what in the details. And I think that would be really helpful, because there's a lot I don't understand. I don't know how to build the buildings that they built then, and I would like to, because they were good buildings.
Yeah. No, there's so much archaeology there that I agree. I mean, I'm totally fascinated by all that, and it's frustrating because there was basically a way that we built cities in this country since the colonial days until about until the Great Depression, And then we just wiped it all away and like started with a clean slate and invented a whole new system of building cities. And we've completely lost that understanding of how we built those places beforehand.
Yeah.
And it's there are things that we know, but I agree with you. I would love to know more of the specific, like the story, the actual stories of who built what, and, were they doing this
And where
as
did
a,
the bricks come from?
yeah, were they doing it as
Like,
a
how
hobby?
did the brick economy work? Because you got
Yeah,
all these brick buildings,
right,
like they weren't being shipped all the way across the country.
right,
How did it work? Are we
exactly.
actually out of clay? Can we not make them anymore? Um,
Did we just have such
you know,
cheap immigrant labor with like no labor rules that
yeah,
made it
that might be
work?
part of the story. Yeah,
Yeah.
the labor was super cheap. I mean, I like to point out, and this is, I think you had Chuck on. I haven't listened to the whole podcast, but he focuses on finance. It's really
Hmm.
important to his understanding of housing. And I agree, housing finance is very important. As a developer, like 70% of our project budget is the hard cost of construction.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your hard costs are like in Kansas City, but here in Providence, it's like if I can get down to 250, it's
Mm.
awesome.
Yeah.
And it's more likely to be $300 a foot just in hard costs. So 1,000 square foot apartment's going to cost $300,000 to build. If you exclude land, architecture, permit fees, financing, developer profit, yada, 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 all of it, just that on the one hand. And then you think back, well, Levittown, they sold those houses for about $100,000 each in today's dollars, about $100 a foot. In today's dollars, they sold houses. They were making money at $100 a foot in our dollars, and we can't build for less than $300 a foot. So, and our houses are better, I'm sure, in a lot of ways, but are they 3 times as better? um,
And there's also
and I was
not much fundamentally different between how we build a house today versus how those Levittown
well,
houses
and
were
that's the
built.
thing. Like, so what does a tile guy get paid in 1920, 1925? Is a lot less, and than a tile guy gets paid today. And how much tile can a tile guy lay? Sounds like a tongue twister. How much tile did the tile guy lay in 2005? Yeah, it's faster. He's got a better saw. He's got better tools. Is it twice as fast? Probably, maybe. Is it 3 times as fast? Well, I don't know. Is it 4 times as fast? But because I bet we're paying him 10 times as much, right?
Hmm.
So there's this. This to me is like actually the biggest problem, because all these other things I kind of have ideas what you could do, and they're like implementation's really hard. We're already got a lot of commitment and momentum going this way. We got to turn the boat. It's going to be really hard. But I like literally don't have a solution for the fact that labor is so much more expensive today, and materials are made with labor, so they're also more expensive. Like,
Yeah.
how do you build more affordable housing? And if you think a $300,000 house is too expensive for a starter home, well, it's impossible to build it for less than that. So
Yeah.
what's your plan, man?
Yeah.
We can't subsidize every starter home. It's just not going to work.
Right.
So to me, that the housing cost is just like the giant problem we're just beginning to think about with building code reform. But I think that's going to be, if zoning was the last 30 years of land use reform, and from CNU to the present, well, like the next 30 years is going to be building code and cost reform.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm totally with you there because you're right. I mean, people don't understand on development stuff that the lion's share of the cost of any project is just it's the bricks and sticks. It's the hard cost of whatever you're doing. And
Yep.
that's frankly why
70%.
I want other architects to get into the development world and understand it and understand that you actually can do things and your fees really are a tiny element of a whole project.
Yeah.
And you'd be much better off being on the ownership side and, making something work. But uh,
Yeah. Yeah. If you can stomach the risk.
so I feel like I got 10 more things I want to talk to you about, but we've already done an hour. And I want to be respectful of your time. Just one last thing. It,
Sure.
as you were talking earlier, especially about the quality of architecture, it just kind of came to my mind. It's just very fresh in my mind because last weekend we were in the Denver area, which has had just explosive growth over the last couple of decades. And I'm fairly blown away by all the new developments. So, and Denver is, a city where they actually build a lot of housing compared to other metros. So they've been able to accommodate a lot of growth, and they had a lot of land for it. So this was just a weird thing. Going around the city, there's an awful lot of what I saw that really checks the planner's toolkits. TOD, Pretty dense mixed use development, especially at the station stops and a lot of other places, a lot of, infill development happening, especially on commercial corridors. And so everything that like a lot of us have been talking about for years, we need to do these things. And I just couldn't help but come away with the impression that I just didn't like almost any of it. And
Was it the scale?
I'm just
Was the buildings too
wrestling.
big?
I don't, a lot of it wasn't even all that big. I'm just wrestling in my mind with what it was that bothered me.
Mm,
I do think a lot of it was just the architecture. Um,
yeah.
and the quality, the design, it just, as I thought about it, as we were walking around, because I love very tight knit, fine grained urban communities, especially historic ones. And I think one of the things that strikes me is like if you go to pick a pick an older city anywhere, you really, even though they're actually quite dense by modern standards, you really get the feeling that like they were made by human beings. And
Yeah.
there's an awful lot of new stuff that we build that even though it checks a lot of those boxes, it there's something about it that just feels really off. Like it's all not, it's hard to find the human touch in any of it.
Yeah.
That's all
I
I
totally
was
agree.
left with.
Yeah. That's absolutely right.
And I feel like that's just something we've got to figure out. We've got to talk about and figure out how to solve it. Because otherwise we're going to build a bunch of stuff that people don't like, and it won't age well. And then in 2 generations, we'll
Well,
tear it all down.
no, that's exactly right. And that's one of the things I worry a lot about is that, I am currently in a building that's like 130 or 140 years old, right? And I expect it to be here for a while longer. And I would hope that if any building does replace it, it's like at least, reasonably good. I guess, and this is, you've been around the CNU conversation for longer than I have. What I'm struck by today is, you know, the the YIMBY movement and the broader abundance movement is mostly, advocates, and then with their friends who are economists and lawyers and journalists, um, and business, people, think tank type. There's not a lot of emphasis on design. There's not a lot of people trying to solve that. How do we design better buildings piece? Right? We're sort of assuming that'll get taken care of. We're just happy to see the big building go up. And I don't know that it's in Strongtown's orbit or ambit to like take on this problem of design, ornamentation, articulation, scale. I mean, it's somewhat present, but it's sort of not their job. I mean, it's sort of too bad CNU doesn't seem like it's going to be able to do that. I don't know. Maybe you disagree.
Uh,
It feels like we need another CNU type endeavor that's really focused, that's aligned and current with these other movements,
yeah,
but that is dragging us and the architectural profession in particular, and developers, frankly, too, who I'm always surprised how many of them actually prefer contemporary design in a vacuum.
yeah,
Like they like clean lines. I don't know why. It's not my jam. Um, but we have to drag that population towards a different strategy.
yeah. I mean,
It's just this is the ideology, right? So it's
yeah,
part of it's scale. Part of the building's too big. That's the scale. Part of it's the business model, right? So
hmm,
I think you and Chuck talked about it. The business model is it's a debt-driven business model,
right,
and for merchant builders who are building a lot of those buildings, they have to recycle capital
yep,
every 5 or 7 years to the fund. They have to hit their IRR targets. There's a whole bunch of reasons why their business model is also bad. That's why I want to, excavate the business model from before we had this debt system, because I would really like to know how they built these buildings. How did they fund them? Where did the capital come from? And then it's also the ideas, right? So I think a lot of people do like these buildings. It's a minority, but they seem to be the minority getting to make the decisions about what the buildings are going to look like.
hmm,
Um,
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot there, and I agree. You're right. It's I feel like we've lost the momentum from the sort of heady days of new urbanism, where design was so much of what we talked about, and there's not enough of that conversation happening now. We've got to figure out a way to kind of plug that back in to
well, I
everything
think
we
I
do.
think you sort of won a bunch of things, but it's all very watered down,
Yeah,
right?
right.
You see, the new urbanist movement made a tremendous amount of change,
Yep.
but most of the things that were adopted broadly are kind of watered down and not. And so I think you need a revived movement that's really focusing on the quality of design and also craftsmanship. I think that would be the the alignment would be that something that is going to focus not just on design in a pure sense, but bring together design and craftsmanship. Our finished carpenters are all in their 60s. Like, who's gonna build this stuff?
I know, man. I know. It's a big question. Yeah. All right, Seth, this was fantastic. I always love talking to you. So if anybody
Thanks,
wants to
Kevin.
find you, how do you want to tell them where to
go? Sure. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Seth Zeren, Zeren, and I have a Substack, like we all do these days, called Build the Next Right Thing. Because I have little kids and we watch a lot of Frozen. That's for all you other dads out there and moms.
Well, I mean, the new one is K-pop Demon Hunters, so we've got to move on.
Yes, no, we watch a lot of K-pop Demon Hunters in the house.
Yeah, it's all the rage, man.
It is all the rage. I haven't found an urbanism angle there yet.
Not yet.
But we'll get there.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you, Kevin. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for reaching out, and it's good catching up with you. And look forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely.